The year was 1878, and the silence of the Texas plains was a living thing. For Elias Vance, it was a constant companion, a heavy blanket woven from dust and grief. His ranch was a scratch upon the vast, unforgiving canvas of the land, a testament to 5 years of relentless labor and a loneliness so profound it had its own weight. The wind, his only regular visitor, howled around the corners of his small, sturdy cabin, speaking a language of desolation he understood perfectly. It whispered of loss, of the grave on the low hill where his wife Martha lay, taken by a fever that had burned through their dreams like a prairie fire. Elias was a man whittled down to his essential parts. The softness had been scoured from him by sun and sorrow, leaving behind a framework of quiet competence and unending routine. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, his movements economical and practiced. He mended fences that the land and the cattle seemed determined to destroy, drew water from a well that threatened to run dry each summer, and tended to his small herd with a grim dedication that had little to do with hope and everything to do with simply continuing. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his property, his heart to the size of a stone in his own chest. He had come here with Martha, full of plans for a future that bloomed as brightly as the wildflowers after a spring rain. They had built the cabin together, their laughter echoing in the frame before the walls went up. Her hands had planted the stubborn little garden that he now neglected, its withered vines a daily reminder of all that had perished. After she was gone, the silence she left behind was louder than any storm. He filled it with work, pushing his body until exhaustion brought a dreamless sleep, for it was only in dreams that her ghost came to visit, her presence a sweet agony he could no longer bear. His trips into the settlement of Redemption were infrequent and born of pure necessity. Redemption was a name that promised far more than the place delivered. It was a clot of dusty buildings on the artery of a cattle trail, populated by men whose faces were hard with opportunism and women whose eyes held a weary resignation. It was a place of loud noises and raw whiskey, of casual cruelty and desperate bargains. Elias hated it. He hated the way the men looked at him, their gazes a mixture of pity for his widower status and suspicion of his solitude. He was an outsider, a man who kept to himself, and in a place like Redemption, that was a sin second only to weakness. On a blistering August day, when the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, the last of his flour ran out. With a heavy sigh, he saddled his horse, a stoic roan named Gideon, and began the long ride. The sun beat down on his hat, and the dust kicked up by Gideon's hooves coated the back of his throat. He felt the familiar dread coil in his gut as the ramshackle buildings of the town appeared on the horizon, a mirage of misery hardening into reality. He tied Gideon to the hitching post outside the general store, his mind already calculating the quickest way to get his supplies and leave. But the usual low hum of the town was different today. There was a current of excitement, a foul energy that drew men from the saloon and the blacksmith's forge like flies to rotting meat. A crowd had gathered in the dusty expanse between the store and the saloon, their voices a low, jeering rumble. Curiosity was a feeling Elias had buried long ago, but a sense of unease pulled him forward. He moved to the edge of the crowd, his height giving him a clear view of the grotesque spectacle at its center. A large, sweat-stained man named Garrett Shaw, a freight hauler with a reputation for brutality, stood on the back of a wagon. Beside him, small and still, stood a figure. It was a woman, he could tell by the shape of her, but her head was covered by a coarse, filthy burlap sack, a rope tied loosely around her neck. Her hands were bound in front of her. She wore the tattered remnants of a deerskin dress, and her bare feet were caked in dust and bleeding from small cuts. "What we have here, gentlemen," Shaw boomed, his voice slick with self-satisfaction, "is a genuine Comanche savage. Caught her myself, skulking near my camp up on the Brazos. A real prize." A wave of murmurs and crude laughter went through the crowd. Elias felt a cold sickness rise in his throat. He had heard of such things, raiders capturing native women and selling them off in backwater towns, but he had never witnessed it. The sheer, unadorned ugliness of it was staggering. The men were not just buying a person, they were buying a story to tell, a trophy of their perceived superiority. "She's broke, mostly," Shaw continued, giving the rope a little tug that made the woman stumble. "Good for cooking, cleaning, whatever else a man might need a squaw for. What am I bid? Let's start at $5. $5 for a lifetime of service." The bidding was slow and laced with lewd jokes. Men shouted out numbers, their bids as much a performance for each other as a genuine attempt to buy. Ilias watched, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He saw not a savage, but a human being humiliated, stripped of dignity, and turned into chattel. The burlap sack was the most obscene part of it all. It denied her a face, a name, an identity. It made her an object, a thing to be owned. He thought of Martha, of her fierce pride and gentle spirit. What if it had been her? The thought was a hot poker to his soul. He should have turned away. He should have gotten his flour and ridden back to the quiet misery of his ranch. It was not his affair. He had enough burdens of his own. But his feet remained planted in the dust, his eyes fixed on the still, sacked figure on the wagon bed. He saw the slight tremor in her bound hands, the only sign of the terror she must be feeling. The bidding stalled at $2. The men were losing interest, their thirst for novelty slaked. Shaw was growing impatient. $2, is that all? It's a disgrace, he spat. Ilias didn't know what moved him. It wasn't courage, and it wasn't righteousness. It was something deeper, a flicker of the man he had been before grief had hollowed him out. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal to let this ugliness stand unchallenged in his presence. His voice, when it came out, was rusty from disuse, but it cut through the murmuring crowd. $1. A stunned silence fell. The men turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and contempt. Garrett Shaw squinted, his piggy eyes narrowing. "What was that, Vance?" "I said $1. Ilias repeated, his voice firmer now. He met Shaw's gaze without flinching. It was an insult, a bid so low it mocked the entire proceeding. Shaw's face flushed a dark, angry red. He opened his mouth to curse Ilias out, but then a different look crossed his facial, cunning, malicious smile. To sell her for such a pittance to the town's somber hermit would be a greater humiliation for the woman and a story in itself. $1 it is, Shaw declared with a laugh. Sold. To the lonely farmer, Ilias Vance. Get your property, you fool. The crowd parted for Ilias as he walked toward the wagon, their whispers and snickers following him like burrs. He ignored them. He pulled a single worn silver dollar from his pocket and tossed it onto the wagon bed. It landed with a soft clink that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. He didn't look at Shaw. He looked only at the woman. With his pocket knife, he reached out and sawed through the thick rope binding her wrists. Then, gently, he took the other rope from around her neck. He gestured with his head toward Gideon. "Come." The journey back to the ranch was a long, silent procession. The woman followed him, her steps light and steady, despite her bare feet. Ilias did not look back, but he could feel her presence behind him, a small, constant shadow in the overwhelming heat. The weight of his impulsive act began to settle on him. What had he done? He had no place for another person, no words for a stranger, no room in his shuttered heart for anything but the ghosts that already lived there. He had bought a human being for the price of a sack of flour. The shame of it burned hotter than the sun. When they reached the ranch, the familiar landscape felt alien. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a tense, uncertain presence. He dismounted and led Gideon to the trough, his movements stiff and awkward. The woman stood near the porch, her head still shrouded in that wretched sack, her posture as still and watchful as a hawk's. He didn't know what to do. He pointed toward the small, clean barn. "You can stay in there," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "There's a cot, a blanket, I'll bring you water and food." She gave no sign that she had heard or understood. He went about his chores with a mechanical slowness, his mind racing. He brought a bucket of fresh water from the well and a plate with a piece of cornbread and some dried jerky, leaving them just inside the barn door. He retreated to his cabin, closing the door behind him as if it could shut out the complication he had just invited into his life. He sat at his small table, staring at the rough wood grain, until the sun began to sink and the cabin filled with shadows. He couldn't leave her like that. He couldn't let her spend the night with that sack over her head. It was an emblem of her humiliation, and now his own. Taking a deep breath, he walked back to the barn. The plate of food was untouched, but the water level in the bucket was lower. She was standing in the center of the barn, exactly where he had last seen her, a sentinel in the gathering gloom. He approached her slowly, his hands held open and away from his body to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, "but it has to come off." She remained perfectly still. He reached out with hesitant fingers, his touch light as he grasped the bottom edge of the burlap. He paused, giving her a chance to pull away, to resist. She did not move. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the sack. The last of the evening light, golden and soft, spilled through the open barn door and fell upon her face. And Elias Vance, for the first time in 5 years, forgot how to breathe. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was. Her face was a sculpture of proud angles and resilient planes, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her eyes dark, deep, and utterly unreadable. But it was not her beauty that struck him dumb. It was the ferocious, untamed dignity in her expression. There was no fear in her eyes, only a watchful intelligence. There was no submission, only an immense, defiant pride that had not been broken on the back of a wagon or bought for a single coin. In her face, he saw the vast, wild plains, the unyielding strength of the ancient hills, the story of a people who could not be erased. In that single, silent moment, something shifted inside him. His action in the town, which had felt like a moment of reckless pity, was transformed. It was no longer about saving a victim. It was about honoring a survivor. A silent, solemn vow took root in his heart. It wasn't a marriage of church or law, but a covenant of the soul, made in the dusty half-light of a barn. He would not be her master, he would be her shield. He would protect this flame of defiance until she was ready to find her own way again. He had paid $1 not for a slave, but for the chance to restore a piece of a shattered world, and in doing so, perhaps, to restore a piece of his own. The days that followed were a study in silence. Elias established a new routine, one that now included a second, silent person. He would leave food and water on the porch of the cabin in the morning and evening. He moved a spare mattress and his late wife's quilt into the barn, creating a more comfortable space for her. He never entered the barn while she was there, affording her the privacy it was in his power to give. Her name, he learned, was Topsana. He didn't learn it from her lips, not at first. He had tried speaking to her a few times, simple words in English, but she remained silent, her dark eyes following his every move with an unnerving stillness. She was a ghost who cast a shadow, a presence defined by her quiet observation. She never strayed far from the barn, her world contained within the small sphere of his ranch, a prisoner of a freedom she did not yet trust. He found out her name from a small, almost imperceptible clue. He had been mending a harness near the corral, his fingers clumsy, and had dropped his awl. He searched the dust for a few frustrating minutes before giving up and heading back to the cabin. The next morning, the awl was sitting on the porch railing, right where he would see it. Beside it, drawn in the dust with a fingertip, was a delicate, intricate shape, the image of a prairie flower. He didn't understand its meaning until later that week when he was cleaning out a small chest of Martha's things. He found a book on local flora and fauna. Flipping through the pages, he saw it the same flower. The caption underneath read Topsana, the Comanche word for it. It was a beginning, a communication without words. He began to leave things for her, not out of necessity, but as offerings. A length of blue calico cloth he'd bought on his last trip to town. A small comb carved from bone. He left them on the porch, and they would disappear, taken in silence. In return, small things would appear for him. A tear in his work shirt, mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. A loose handle on an axe, expertly tightened and secured with a strip of rawhide. They were building a language of gestures, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their two worlds. Elias found himself watching her, not with the eyes of an owner, but with a growing sense of wonder. He watched her move with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the harsh, angular landscape. He saw her studying the plants that grew wild at the edge of his property, her fingers gently touching leaves and petals as if greeting old friends. He saw her watching the sky, her face tilted up to read the clouds and the flight of birds in a way he never could. She possessed a knowledge of the land that he, for all his years of toil, could never hope to match. He was a trespasser here. She was a part of it. The change in him was slow, almost imperceptible at first. The crushing weight of his loneliness began to lift, replaced by a new kind of quiet. It was a shared quiet, no longer empty, but filled with a watchful presence. He started talking again, not directly to her, but to himself, to Gideon, to the world at large. He would describe the task he was doing, or comment on the weather, his voice filling the space between them. He never expected a reply, and he never received one. But he had the distinct feeling that he was being listened to. The first true crack in the wall of silence came with the storm. It blew in from the north without warning, a churning mass of black clouds that turned the afternoon sky to night. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the cabin. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid sheets, and hail the size of pebbles hammered the earth. Elias rushed to get the cattle into their small shelter, fighting against the gale. As he struggled to bar the gate, he saw her. Topsana was standing in the open doorway of the barn, her figure silhouetted against the gloom, watching the violent sky. He shouted over the roar of the wind, "Get inside, it's not safe." He didn't think she would obey, but as a tremendous crack of lightning split the sky, followed by an immediate, deafening clap of thunder, she flinched. He saw a tremor run through her body, a flicker of the terror she kept so well hidden. Without thinking, he ran from the corral to the barn, grabbed her arm, and pulled her toward the relative safety of the cabin. He half-pushed her through the door and slammed it shut against the raging storm, plunging the small room into near darkness. For a long moment, they stood there, breathing heavily, the sound of the wind and rain a deafening roar outside. Rainwater dripped from their hair and clothes, forming puddles on the wooden floor. Elias moved to the fireplace and struck a match. The kindling caught, and a small, flickering light pushed back the shadows. He turned to look at her. She was huddled near the door, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide. The storm had stripped away her careful composure, revealing a raw vulnerability. "It will pass," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked at him, and for the first time her gaze was not just watchful but questioning. She took a hesitant step toward the fire, drawn to its warmth. Elias moved away, giving her space, and sat at his table. They spent the next hour in that small, enclosed world, a silent truce declared against the fury outside. The storm was a shared enemy, and in their shared shelter they were, for a moment, equals. When the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening, the tension between them had changed. It was no longer a taut wire of mistrust, but something more pliant, more uncertain. A few nights later, Elias was woken by a sound from his own throata choked cry. He was tangled in his blankets, his heart pounding, the ghost of a nightmare clinging to him. It was the dream of Martha, her face pale with fever, her hand growing cold in his. He sat up, breathing hard, and ran a shaky hand over his face. A faint sound from outside his window made him freeze. He looked and saw her silhouette standing near the cabin. She had heard him. Shame washed over him. He had shown a weakness he kept hidden from the world. He expected her to be gone by morning, repelled by his brokenness. But when he opened his door at dawn, she was sitting on the porch steps, waiting. As he emerged, she stood up. She looked at him, then spoke a single word, her voice low and raspy, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. Elias. It was his name, the first word she had ever spoken to him. It was not a question or a statement, but an acknowledgement. She had seen his pain, and she had not run from it. He nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Topsana, he replied, speaking her name aloud for the first time. It was as if a dam had broken. The words did not come in a flood, but in a slow, steady trickle. She began to speak to him in a mixture of broken English and Comanche words, which he slowly began to piece together. She told him of the raid on her camp, of the terror and the chaos, of being torn from her family. She spoke of her husband, a warrior named Kuruk, and her small son, Ahanu, and how she did not know if they were alive or dead. Her grief was a raw, open wound, and in sharing it, she gave Elias permission to touch his own. He found himself telling her about Martha. He spoke of her laughter, of the way she believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He talked about the plans they had, the children they had hoped for. He spoke until his voice was raw, unearthing memories he had buried for years. In the quiet presence of this woman who had lost everything, he could finally mourn. Their shared sorrow became the soil in which a new kind of understanding grew. They were two solitary survivors, two people scarred by the cruelties of the world, who had found an unlikely harbor in each other's presence. The ranch was no longer just his place of exile, it was becoming their sanctuary. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. Word of Elias Vance and his Comanche squaw had festered in the bitter heart of redemption. It was a story told with winks and sneers in the saloon, a dark piece of gossip that fed the town's inherent prejudice. Garrett Shaw, in particular, felt cheated. He had intended the woman for a life of brutal servitude, and the thought of her living in peace with the strange, quiet farmer was an insult to his authority. He saw it as a challenge, one he intended to answer. One hot, still afternoon, Elias saw the dust cloud on the horizon long before he heard the horses. He knew, with a sinking certainty, who it was. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall, his movements calm and deliberate. "Go inside the cabin," he told Topsana, who was tending to a small patch of herbs she had planted near the porch. "Lock the door." She looked from his face to the approaching riders, and a grim understanding passed between them. She nodded, her face a mask of composure, and slipped inside the cabin, the heavy bar thudding into place. Elias stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited. 4 riders pulled up, led by Garrett Shaw. Their faces were flushed with whiskey and self-righteous anger. "Vance," Shaw spat, staying on his horse to loom over him. "We heard some disturbing things. Heard you were living out here in sin with that savage." "What I do on my land is my own business, Shaw," Elias said, his voice level. "Not when it offends decent folk," another man chimed in. "It ain't right. We've come to take her. We'll find a proper place for her." The lie was so bold it was almost laughable. Their intentions were written plainly on their leering faces. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. "She's not going anywhere." Shaw laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She ain't got a choice, and neither do you. We paid for her once, in a manner of speaking. She belongs to the town now." He started to dismount, a clear threat in his movement. "She is my wife." The words left Elias's mouth before he had consciously formed them. They were a shield, a claim, a truth forged in silence and shared grief. The men stared at him, momentarily stunned into silence. Shaw recovered first, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and rage. "Your wife? You married a redskin?" He spat on the ground. You're sicker than I thought, Vance. That changes nothing. We're taking her. As Shaw took a step forward, the cabin door opened. Topsana stepped out onto the porch. She was not holding a weapon. She was holding the blue calico cloth he had given her, now sewn into a simple but elegant shawl. She stood beside Elias, her head held high, her gaze sweeping over the men with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Her presence was not that of a cowering victim, but of a queen surveying a pack of mongrels. Her silent defiance was more potent than any threat. It enraged Shaw. He lunged for the porch, his hand reaching for her. It was the last step he took. Elias moved with a speed that belied his quiet nature. He didn't raise the rifle to shoot. He used it as a club, swinging the heavy stock in a short, brutal arc that connected with Shaw's side. The man grunted, a sharp exhalation of pained surprise, and staggered back. The other men, startled by the sudden violence from the placid farmer, hesitated. "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice a low growl of absolute conviction. He raised the rifle, this time leveling the barrel at Shaw's chest. "She is Mrs. Vance. This is her home. Anyone who tries to harm her will answer to me. Now get, and don't ever come back." There was no madness in his eyes, only a cold, deadly seriousness. The men looked at Elias, then at the silent, proud woman beside him, and they saw not two broken people, but a unified, unbreachable front. They were bullies, not warriors. The fight had gone out of them. Muttering curses, they helped the wheezing Shaw back onto his horse and rode away, their retreat a cloud of resentful dust. Elias stood there until they were out of sight, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He slowly lowered the rifle. He turned and looked at Topsana. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on his. The declaration he had made, "She is my wife," hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. She reached out and laid her hand gently on the barrel of the rifle, pushing it down. Then her fingers brushed the back of his hand. It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate, gentle affection. In that small, simple gesture, an entire volume of understanding was conveyed. The vow he had made in the barn had now been spoken aloud to the world, and she, with her touch, had accepted it. The aftermath of the confrontation settled into a new kind of peace. The threat from the town receded, replaced by a grudging, fearful respect for the man who had defended his home so fiercely. Elias and Topsana were left to their sanctuary, their bond now sealed by shared danger and public commitment. Their life together took on a new rhythm. The silence between them was now one of comfort, not caution. They worked side by side, their movements a practiced dance of mutual support. She taught him the language of the land, which roots were for medicine, which berries were for dye, how to read the coming weather in the turn of a leaf. He, in turn, shared the small pieces of his own world, reading to her from one of Martha's books in the evenings by the firelight, explaining the strange mechanics of the world he came from. They spoke of their losses, not as fresh wounds, but as scars that told the stories of who they were. Her grief for her lost family remained, a deep, quiet river running beneath the surface of her life. His sorrow for Martha softened from a sharp pain to a gentle, bittersweet memory. They did not replace what they had lost. Instead, they built something new in the space that grief had cleared. One evening, a year after she had arrived, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. The air was cool and smelled of dust and the herbs from her garden. She had been weaving a basket from willow branches, her fingers moving with an innate, graceful skill. "Elias," she said, her voice soft in the twilight. "In the language of my people there is no word for goodbye. We say, 'I will see you again.' I think maybe I will not see my son again in this life." It was a quiet admission of a hope finally laid to rest. Elias reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I am sorry, Topsana," he whispered. She turned her hand over and held his tightly. "But my home, it was taken from me, and now I have a home here." She looked at him, and in her dark eyes he saw not just pride and resilience, but a deep and abiding love. It was a love that had grown slowly, quietly, like a hardy flower pushing its way through rocky soil. He looked around at the small ranch, at the cabin that had once been his prison of sorrow. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, with the smell of her cooking, with the sight of her handiwork. It was a home again. He had paid $1 for a woman in a sack, an act of desperate, unthinking compassion, and in return she had given him back his life. The wind still whispered across the plains, but it no longer spoke of desolation. It sang a new song now, a song of two solitary souls who had found each other in the vast, empty wilderness and built a world together. A quiet testament to the enduring power of kindness and the unexpected resilience of the human heart. The year was 1887, and the high plains of Wyoming had a way of wringing the hope from a man. For Owen Prescott, hope was a foreign currency he had stopped trading in long ago. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his sprawling, neglected ranch, a kingdom of dust and silence lorded over by the ghosts of what might have been. At 60 years of age, Owen was a man of considerable size, a mountain of flesh that seemed to have accumulated like soil settling over a grave. His breath came in labored rasps, and his heart hammered a resentful protest against the simplest of tasks. He had not always been this way. There was a photograph on the mantel, clouded with grime, of a younger, leaner man with a fierce pride in his eyes, his arm around a smiling woman named Mary. But Mary was gone, taken by a fever 20 winters past, and the pride in the man's eyes had long since been buried under layers of grief and fat. His life was a metronome of bleak routine. He rose before the sun, his great weight groaning against the ropes of his bed. He would tend to the cattle, his movements slow and ponderous, the work that once brought him satisfaction now just a mechanical necessity to keep the whole decaying enterprise from collapsing. He ate alone at a long oak table built for a family, his meals joyless and vast. The silence in the house was a physical presence, so deep and profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the floorboards, smothering the air. The town of Redemption Gulch, a raw collection of clapboard buildings 10 miles away, might as well have been on the moon. He went only when supplies became a desperate need, enduring the stares and whispers of the townsfolk who saw him not as a man grieving, but as a grotesque spectacle, a cautionary tale of letting go. Owen was in a state of stasis, a long, slow decay of the soul. He was not living, merely existing, waiting for the land to finally claim him as it had claimed his wife. He had resigned himself to this quiet, lonely end. It was all he felt he deserved. The arrangement was made on one of his rare, necessary trips to the trading post near the reservation. The Lakota had suffered a devastating winter, followed by a summer of drought that withered the corn and drove the last of the game from their ancestral lands. The government rations were a cruel joke: weeviled flour and rancid pork. Desperation had a sharp, metallic taste, and it drove good men to impossible choices. The elder, Chayton, a man whose face was a roadmap of hardship and dignity, approached him not as a beggar, but as a man making a grim treaty. He spoke in halting English, his eyes never leaving Owen's. He spoke of his granddaughter, Winona. She was 18, strong, and a hard worker. She could keep a home, cook, mend, and was of childbearing age. The elder's words were stark, stripped of sentiment. It was a trade, a life for many lives. His granddaughter's future in exchange for a dozen head of cattle and enough flour, salt, and blankets to see his people through the coming winter. Owen had stared, his mind a slow, muddy river. A wife. The word was an absurdity, a relic from another man's life. Yet, in the deepest, most desolate corner of his heart, a flicker of something stirred. Not desire, not hope, but a profound, aching loneliness he refused to name. He looked at the hard, barren land around him, at the empty house waiting for him, and heard the crushing silence that would greet him. He agreed. Winona arrived a week later, brought by her grandfather on a tired-looking pony. She stood before Owen's porch, a small, straight figure wrapped in a trade blanket, her worldly possessions in a single rawhide bundle. She was not merely beautiful, she possessed a stillness, a centered gravity that seemed at odds with her youth. Her black hair was parted in the middle, woven into two thick braids that fell past her waist. Her face was a perfect, solemn oval, her eyes dark and deep, and in their depths a fire of fierce intelligence and terror burned in equal measure. She did not look at him, but at a point just past his shoulder, as if studying the unyielding horizon she was now bound to. Her presence was a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of his life. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was now charged with her fear and his discomfort. He was a 60-year-old man, broken and obese, and she was an 18-year-old girl, sold to him like livestock. The shame of the transaction sat heavy and sour in his gut. He motioned her inside with a clumsy jerk of his head, the first gesture in their new life together. The door closed behind her, shutting out the world and sealing them in, two strangers bound by a contract of desperation. The air in the house changed instantly. It was no longer just a tomb for his memories. It was now a cage for her future. The first days were a lesson in the architecture of silence. They moved around each other like celestial bodies locked in a miserable orbit, governed by forces they could not control but compelled to maintain their distance. Owen found his routines shattered. He was acutely aware of her every movement, the soft scuff of her moccasins on the floorboards, the quiet way she handled the pots and pans in the kitchen he had long neglected. He would show her things with grunts and points, the pump for the well, the woodpile, the smokehouse. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, his voice a rusty hinge. The stove draws from the left. We eat when the sun is high. Winona, for her part, was a phantom of quiet efficiency. She spoke not at all. Her silence was not submissive. It was a wall, a fortress she had erected around herself. Her eyes, dark and observant, missed nothing. She saw the thick layer of dust on every surface, the grime on the windows that choked the sunlight, the cold, dead ashes in the main hearth. She saw the faded photograph on the mantel and understood, with an instinct born of her own losses, that this house was a shrine to a ghost. She moved with a purpose that unnerved him, sweeping away the cobwebs of his neglect, scrubbing the floors until the wood gleamed, washing the windows until the harsh Wyoming light flooded the dim rooms. She was cleaning away his grief, and it made him profoundly uncomfortable. He felt exposed, as if her cleaning was an excavation of his soul. He retreated further into his gruffness, his monosyllabic replies becoming shorter, sharper. He would leave her food on the kitchen tablet, a slab of bacon, a sack of Flurand, retreat to the barn, finding solace in the familiar, unjudging company of his animals. Their meals were the tensest moments of all. They sat at opposite ends of the long oak table, the vast, polished space between them, a canyon of unspoken resentment and fear. The only sounds were the scrape of his fork on his plate and the delicate, almost inaudible sounds of her eating. He ate with the same joyless voracity as always, but now he felt her eyes on him. He felt judged by her stillness, by her small portions, by the quiet dignity with which she consumed the food he provided. He was her keeper, her provider, but in her silent presence he felt like the savage. He was the one who had bought a person. One afternoon he found her in his and Mary's old bedroom. He had kept the door shut for 20 years. She had opened it, and the stale air of the past had billowed out. She was standing by the bed, holding a small, silver-backed hairbrush, her fingers tracing the intricate floral pattern. The bed was still covered with one of Mary's quilts. Winona looked up as he filled the doorway, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a kind of startled curiosity. "Get out," he rasped, his voice thick with a pain so old it was part of his marrow. She did not flinch. She placed the brush carefully back on the dusty dresser, her movements deliberate and respectful. Then she walked past him, her head held high, and the scent of sage and wood smoke followed her down the hall, an alien fragrance in a room that had only smelled of lavender and decay. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot, and leaned his great weight against it, his heart a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He was not just guarding a room, he was guarding the ruins of his heart. And she, with her silent, knowing eyes, had trespassed. The landscape turned on them in early November. The sky, which for weeks had been a sheet of indifferent blue, became a bruised, heavy grey. The wind picked up, howling like a thing grieving, and soon the air was thick with a blinding curtain of snow. The blizzard descended without mercy, a white fury that erased the horizon and imprisoned them in the house. For Owen, it was a familiar trial. For Winona, it was a new kind of cage. The storm raged for 3 days. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the ranch house. The constant, shrieking wind made conversation impossible, even if they had possessed the words for it. The cold was a living entity, seeping through the chinks in the logs, breathing its icy breath across the floor. They worked in a state of unspoken truce, driven by the shared, primal need for survival. He kept the fires roaring, his large frame a constant presence by the hearth as he fed logs into the flames. She sealed the windows with strips of cloth and ensured the dwindling food supplies were used with care, preparing hot, nourishing broths that warmed them from the inside out. On the second night, a sound like a pistol crack echoed from the main room. A heavy branch, laden with ice and snow, had broken from the cottonwood tree and smashed against the roof. A moment later, a steady drip began near the hearth. Water, dark and cold, splattered onto the floorboards. Owen cursed, a low rumble in his chest. He grabbed a bucket and placed it under the leak. It was a temporary fix. The leak would worsen, rot the roof beam, and threaten the integrity of the house. He knew he would have to go up on the roof, into the teeth of the storm, to clear the branch and patch the hole. It was a fool's errand, a task for a younger, more agile man. He pulled on his heaviest coat, his movements slow and clumsy. As he reached for the door, a small hand touched his arm. He stopped, startled by the contact. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "You will fall." He looked down at her. Her face was tilted up to his, her dark eyes filled not with fear for herself, but with a clear, rational concern. She saw him not as her captor, but as an old man about to do something dangerously stupid. "It must be done," he grunted, shaking her hand off, more out of habit than anger. She did not argue. Instead, she pointed towards the attic ladder. There, from inside. She then gestured to a pile of spare tarps and shingles he had forgotten in a corner of the barn. She had seen them, catalogued them, remembered them. While he had been mired in his routine, she had been learning the landscape of her prison, every detail of its strength and weakness. He stared at her, a flicker of grudging respect cutting through his stubbornness. She was right. They worked together. He, too large to navigate the tight attic space, passed tools and materials up to her. She, nimble and light, moved confidently among the rafters, her form silhouetted against the grey light filtering through the hole. She worked with a focused intensity, her small hands surprisingly strong as she nailed the patch into place. He watched from below, handing her a hammer, holding a lantern, a strange sense of partnership settling over them. For those few hours, they were not captor and captive, old man and young girl. They were simply two people fighting a storm, protecting their shelter. When she climbed down, dusted with snow that had blown in, her face was flushed from the cold and exertion. A strand of black hair had escaped its braid and clung to her cheek. For the first time, he saw not the stoic symbol of his shame, but the girl herself, fierce and capable. Later that evening, the storm still screaming outside, she sat by the fire, mending one of his torn shirts. The silence between them had changed. The heavy, resentful weight was gone, replaced by something lighter, a quiet space of shared experience. He found himself watching her hands as she worked the needle, her stitches small and even. She began to hum, a low, melodic sound that was both haunting and beautiful. It was a song of sorrow, a lament for a lost world, but it filled the room with a humanity that had been absent for 2 decades. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "What is that song?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. She stopped humming, her hands stilling in her lap. She looked into the fire. "It is a song for those who are gone," she said softly. "My mother sang it." He said nothing more, but he did not retreat into his shell. He simply sat and listened as she, after a moment, began to hum again. In the heart of the blizzard, inside the house they had just saved together, Owen Prescott felt a thaw begin in a place he had thought forever frozen. He was listening to the song of her grief, and in it he heard an echo of his own. After the blizzard broke, the world was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The air was sharp and clean, and the ranch, which had felt like a cage, now seemed like the only solid thing in an endless sea of snow. The shared ordeal had subtly but irrevocably altered the dynamic between them. The silence was no longer a weapon but a space they could comfortably inhabit. Words, when they came, were still sparse, but they were no longer purely functional. One afternoon, he came into the kitchen to find her grinding dried chokecherries with a stone mortar and pestle she had fashioned herself. The rhythmic, grating sound was earthy and elemental. She was making wasna, a traditional food of her people. He watched for a moment before speaking. "My wife Mary," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "she used to make preserves, from the berries down by the creek." Winona paused her grinding and looked at him. She nodded, a simple acknowledgement that he had shared something of himself, a tiny piece of the story locked in the closed-off room. It was an invitation, and a week later he found the door to Mary's room standing open. The air inside was fresh, the window clean. Winona had not disturbed anything, but she had aired out the stale grief, letting the light in. On the dresser, next to the silver-backed brush, she had placed a single eagle feather. It was a gesture of respect, an understanding that passed between them without a word. He began to notice things about her he had previously ignored. He saw the way she would walk the perimeter of the ranch every morning, her eyes scanning the snow for tracks, her senses more attuned to the land than his ever were. He saw her leaving scraps of food for the winter birds, a small act of kindness in a harsh world. One day he found her tending to one of his horses that had a nasty gash on its leg. She had made a poultice from willow bark and herbs she'd gathered before the snow, her touch gentle and confident as she cleaned the wound. "You have a way with them," he said, his tone one of gruff approval. "They are honest," she replied, not looking up from her work. "They do not lie about their pain." Her words struck him. He thought of his own pain, the mountain of it he had hidden beneath layers of silence and flesh. He had been lying about it, to the world, and to himself, for 20 years. He started making small gestures of his own. On a supply run to Redemption Gulch trip he now made with a grim sense of purpose, rather than just bleak necessity, he bought a length of deep blue wool cloth, the color of a twilight sky. He left it on the kitchen table without a word. The next day she was wearing it as a shawl. The vibrant blue was a stark and beautiful contrast to the drab grays and browns of the house. His perception of her had shifted completely. He no longer saw the transaction, the purchased bride. He saw Winona. He saw her strength, her quiet intelligence, her unyielding dignity. He saw the deep well of sadness she carried for her own lost family and way of life. A protective instinct, long dormant, began to stir within him. He was still an old, broken man, but he found himself wanting to shield this young woman from any more harm, to protect the fragile peace they were building. She, in turn, began to see past the grotesque exterior he presented to the world. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. She saw the way his hands, though clumsy with his bulk, were still strong and capable when fixing a harness or splitting wood. She saw the weariness of a man who had carried a burden for too long. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of digging out snowdrifts, he collapsed into a chair by the fire, his breathing ragged, his face pale with exhaustion. She brought him a cup of hot broth without being asked, her presence a silent offering of care. He took it, their fingers brushing for a moment, and he met her gaze. In her eyes he did not see disgust or pity, he saw understanding. The emotional distance between them was shrinking, melting away like the snow under a spring sun. The thaw meant the road to Redemption Gulch was finally passable, and their supplies were perilously low. The trip was a necessity they could no longer postpone. Owen felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. In the isolation of the ranch, they had created their own world with its own fragile rules. The town was the outside world, a place of judgment and cruelty, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that it would not be kind. He brought the wagon around to the front of the house. Winona climbed up beside him, her back straight, her face impassive, though he could see the tension in her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. As they rode, the comfortable silence they had cultivated on the ranch felt different, thinner, a fragile shield against what was to come. The moment they drove down the muddy main street of Redemption Gulch, the staring began. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to turn and watch them pass. Their gazes were a physical weight, a mixture of hostile curiosity and open contempt. They saw what their prejudice wanted them to see: a fat, old man who had bought himself an Indian squaw, a creature somewhere between a servant and a pet. The whispers followed them like flies. Owen kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his jaw tight. He felt a hot shame, but underneath it, something else was simmering, a cold, protective anger. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and lumbered down, his size making him an even more conspicuous target. "Stay here," he ordered Winona, his voice lower than usual. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken hostility. Mr. Callahan, the proprietor, served him with a clipped, dismissive air. As Owen paid for his goods, the door swung open and a group of men swaggered in. At their lead was Bill Donovan, a man whose arrogance was as much a part of him as his cheap cologne and cruel smirk. Donovan owned a small, failing freight business and compensated for his insecurities by bullying those he deemed weaker than himself. Donovan's eyes landed on Owen, then flickered to the wagon outside. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here, boys," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Old man Prescott finally come down from his mountain, getting some supplies for your new housekeeper." He infused the word with a greasy insinuation. Owen ignored him, gathering his sacks of flour and sugar. He just wanted to leave. But Donovan was not finished. He moved to block Owen's path to the door. "I hear you paid a pretty price for her," Donovan continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "Tell me, Prescott, is she as wild in the bed as they say her kind are?" Something inside Owen, a line he had drawn long ago between his private grief and the public world, snapped. The cold anger ignited into a hot, white rage. He had not felt anything so fiercely in 20 years. He dropped the sacks. His movement was surprisingly fast for a man of his size. He grabbed the front of Donovan's shirt, his huge hand bunching the fabric, and slammed him back against a stack of barrels. The impact sent jars rattling on the shelves. "You will not speak of her," Owen snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that silenced the room. His face was inches from Donovan's, his eyes blazing with a fire the town had never seen. "You will not look at her. You will not even think her name. Do you understand me?" Donovan, his face pale with shock and fear, could only manage a choked nod. Owen held him there for a moment longer, letting the man feel the sheer brute strength behind his rage. Then he shoved him away. Donovan stumbled back, catching himself before he fell, his bravado utterly shattered. Owen turned, picked up his supplies, and walked out of the store without a backward glance, leaving a stunned and silent room behind him. He loaded the wagon, his hands trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline. He climbed back into the driver's seat beside Winona. She had seen it all through the store window. Her face was still impassive, but her eyes were fixed on him, and in their dark depths something new had kindled. She had seen him defend her, not just her presence, but her honor. It was an act of loyalty, an unexpected and powerful declaration. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence had transformed once more. It was no longer fragile, it was solid, forged in the fire of that confrontation. They had entered the town as a master and his purchased dependent. They were leaving it as partners, an unlikely us against the sneering, hostile them. Donovan's hatred, meant to divide and humiliate them, had only succeeded in binding them together. Bill Donovan was not a man to accept humiliation. Owen's public defense of Winona had been a direct challenge to his fragile ego, and it festered in him like a sickness. In the weeks that followed, a poison seeped through Redemption Gulch. Donovan, fueled by whiskey and resentment, spread vicious stories. He painted Owen as a lecherous old fool and Winona as a cunning savage who had him bewitched. He made crude jokes about her, his words always finding their way back to Owen through the gossip mill that was the town's primary form of entertainment. The threat was no longer just whispers and stares, it became palpable. One morning, Owen found the gate to his main pasture thrown open, his cattle scattered across the open range. It took him 2 days of hard, punishing labor to round them up. Another time, he found the word squaw painted in crude yellow letters on his barn door. He scrubbed it off before Winona could see it, his heart pounding with a cold, slow fury. He was being tested, and he knew Donovan was behind it. The man was a coward, striking from the shadows, trying to break him, to drive him and Winona out. The escalation forced them into an even tighter alliance. They became more watchful, more reliant on each other. Owen started carrying his Winchester with him everywhere, even just across the yard to the barn. Winona's quiet observation intensified. Her knowledge of the land became their first line of defense. She noticed things: he missed a broken twig on a trail that shouldn't be there, the nervous quiet of the birds that signaled a nearby presence. She was his eyes and ears. One evening, she came to him while he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight. "He will not stop," she said. It was not a question. "I know," Owen replied, not looking up from his task. "He wants to hurt you. He wants to take me." She said the words without inflection, a statement of fact, but he could hear the undercurrent of fear. He stopped his work and finally met her gaze. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw. "I will not let that happen," he said, his voice imbued with a conviction that surprised even himself. 20 years of apathy had been burned away, replaced by a singular, fierce purpose: to protect this woman, to defend the home they were now building together. This ranch was no longer a place for him to die, it was a place for them to live, and he would fight for it. The stakes had been raised from a matter of pride to a matter of life and death. The coming confrontation felt as inevitable as the setting sun. The attack came on a moonless night. A storm was brewing in the distance, the air thick and heavy with anticipation. Owen had felt it coming all day, a prickling on his skin, a sense of deep unease that had kept his rifle close at hand. Winona had been quiet and watchful, her senses on high alert. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, frantic barking of the dog, cut short by a sickening yelp. Silence descended again, heavier and more menacing than before. Owen grabbed his Winchester from its place by the door and blew out the main lantern, plunging the room into the dim, flickering light of the hearth. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered in a low voice. Winona needed no instruction. She was already moving, a shadow in the darkness. She did not cower or scream. She picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a solid, deadly thing in her hands. Her eyes met Owen's across the room, and in that shared glance was a grim understanding. They would face this together. A voice called from the darkness outside, thick with whiskey and malice. "Prescott, we know you're in there, you old sow. Send out your little pet, and we might let you live to see the sunrise." It was Donovan's voice, joined by the drunken laughter of at least two other men. Owen moved to a position beside the main window, keeping himself shielded by the thick log wall. "You're on my land, Donovan," he yelled back, his voice a deep roar. "Leave now, or be carried off it." A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door frame. The time for talk was over. Owen raised his rifle, sighted on a bulky shadow moving near the barn, and fired. A cry of pain ripped through the night, followed by a string of curses. He had hit one of them. What happened next was a blur of calculated chaos. Another shot shattered a window, sending glass spraying into the room. While Owen reloaded and fired back, keeping the men pinned down behind the water trough, Winona acted. She slipped out the back door into the kitchen garden, moving with a speed and silence that was breathtaking. She knew this land, every dip and shadow. She was not a damsel in distress waiting for rescue. She was a warrior defending her territory. Owen saw a flicker of movement near the side of the house where the men were concentrating their fire. He realized with a jolt of terror that Donovan was trying to circle around to the back. He was about to yell a warning when a scream tore through the night, not of pain, but of pure shock. He peered out to see one of Donovan's cronies staggering backward, clutching his face, a dark gash across his cheek. From the shadows of the woodpile, Winona emerged, the fire poker held like a weapon. She had created the diversion he needed. As the injured man stumbled away, Donovan, enraged, turned his attention to her. He raised his pistol. Owen's heart stopped. He had a clear shot, but Donovan was between him and Winona. In that split second, Owen did the only thing he could. He abandoned the safety of the house, bursting through the front door like an enraged bear, roaring Donovan's name. His massive form was a terrifying sight in the dim light. The sheer, unexpected audacity of his charge startled Donovan, who hesitated for a fatal second. It was all the time Owen needed. He didn't fire. He closed the distance and brought the heavy stock of his Winchester down in a brutal arc against Donovan's gun arm. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol clattered to the dirt. Donovan howled in agony, clutching his shattered wrist. The fight was over. The other man, seeing his leader incapacitated, had already fled into the darkness. Donovan, cradling his ruined arm, glared at Owen with pure, unadulterated hatred before he too stumbled away, his threats dissolving into pathetic, pain-filled sobs. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the approaching rumble of the storm. Owen stood over the dropped pistol, his chest heaving, his body screaming with a pain and exertion it had not known in decades. Winona came to his side, the iron poker still in her hand. They stood there for a moment in the dirt yard, surrounded by the evidence of the battle-splintered wood, shattered glass, the metallic scent of blood in the air. The violence had stripped away everything but the essential truth. He had fought for her, she had fought for him. They had defended their home, together. In the quiet aftermath, as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, Owen finally looked at Winona. He saw the fierce strength in her, the courage that burned brighter than any fire. And she looked at him, at this great, broken mountain of a man who had charged into gunfire to protect her. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. They went back inside, the storm breaking overhead in a cleansing torrent. The house was a wreck, the air acrid with the smell of gunpowder, but it was safe. It was theirs. Without a word, Winona took a cloth and began to tend to a shallow cut on Owen's forehead, where a piece of flying glass had grazed him. Her touch was gentle, exquisitely careful. The simple act of her tending to his wound was more intimate than any embrace. As she cleaned the cut, he reached up and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a question and an answer all in one. "Mary," he said, his voice quiet and hoarse. "She died in this house. After she was gone, the light went out. I thought it would be dark forever." He looked around the room, at the chaos and the destruction, and then back at her. You brought the light back, Winona. Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. They were not tears of sorrow, but of release. My name, she said, her voice barely a whisper, is Wachiwi. It means dancing girl. My mother gave it to me. She had shared her truest self with him, the name from the life she had lost. Wachiwi, he repeated the name, a soft prayer on his lips. It's beautiful. He looked at this young woman, this dancing girl who had faced down terror with an iron poker and a spirit far stronger than steel. He saw the resilience that had carried her through the loss of her home, her family, and her freedom. He saw the quiet grace with which she had breathed life back into his dead house and his dead heart. And he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was not the memory of the love he had lost, but the overwhelming presence of a new one, a love he had never expected to feel again. It was a love born of shared hardship and mutual respect, quiet and deep as a river. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, a new equilibrium. The broken window was replaced, the splintered door mended. The physical scars of the attack faded, but the bond it had forged between them was permanent. The silence in the house was now a comfortable blanket, filled with the easy companionship of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words. Owen began to change. He walked more, his movements less labored. He ate with more care, the joyless consumption replaced by shared meals with Wachiwi. He even began to lose some of the great weight he had carried for so long, the physical manifestation of his grief shrinking as the grief itself finally began to heal. He started talking about the ranch not as a burden, but as a future, pointing out to her which fields he planned to sow in the spring, which fences needed strengthening. Wachiwi, in turn, truly made the place her home. She planted a garden near the kitchen, her hands coaxing green shoots from the stubborn soil. The bright colors of squash blossoms and beans were a defiant splash of life against the muted landscape. She brought her own traditions into the house, filling it with the scent of burning sage and the soft cadence of her songs. She taught him the names of the stars in her language, her voice a soft murmur in the vast, quiet nights. Their marriage, once a grim contract of shame and desperation, had been reforged by their own hands into a genuine partnership, a sanctuary against the harshness of the world. One evening, months later, they sat on the porch as the sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky. The land, which had once seemed so empty and hostile to him, was now imbued with a quiet beauty. He looked at Wachiwi, at her serene profile outlined against the vibrant sunset. The 18-year-old girl he had purchased was gone, replaced by a confident, strong woman who was his partner in every sense of the word. He, the obese, 60-year-old rancher, the town spectacle, was gone too. In his place was a man who had found a reason to live, a man who had found an unexpected and profound love in the last chapter of his life. She turned and met his gaze, a soft smile gracing her lips. She did not need to speak. He did not need to speak. In the quiet space between them, a whole world existed, a world of shared struggle, of unexpected kindness, of deep, abiding affection. They had been two broken souls, thrown together by a cruel world, but in their shared isolation, they had found more than just survival. They had found resilience, they had found acceptance, they had found home.